There are some meals that define dinner tables across America during the 1960s and 1970s, and pork chops were absolutely at the center of it. All these thick cuts of meat were affordable, versatile, and could be dressed up or down depending on what mom had in the pantry. But the way we prepared pork chops back then was completely different from today. We're talking about recipes that involved canned soups, fruit cocktails, and spice packets that promised to make dinner magical. So let's take a look back at 25 forgotten pork chop recipes that families across America enjoyed. Pork chops with cream of mushroom soup. One of the most popular ways to prepare pork chops during the 1960s was to smother them in cream of mushroom soup. This Campbell's classic was a kitchen staple that appeared in countless recipes, and pork chops were no exception. Mom would brown the chops in a skillet until they had a nice golden crust. Then she'd pour an entire can of cream of mushroom soup right over the top. Sometimes she'd thin it out with a little milk or water to make more gravy, and then the whole thing would simmer on the stovetop or bake in the oven until the meat was fall apart tender. The result was pork chops swimming in a thick creamy mushroom gravy that soaked into whatever side dish was served, alongside usually mashed potatoes or egg noodles. The beauty of this recipe was its simplicity. You didn't need fancy ingredients or complicated techniques, just a can opener and a little patience. Kids loved it because the gravy made everything taste rich and comforting, and parents loved it because it was practically foolproof. Nowadays, cream of mushroom soup has fallen out of favor as people cook more from scratch. But back then, it was the secret weapon in every home cook's arsenal: shake and bake, pork chops. In 1965, General Foods introduced shake and bake, and it revolutionized the way America cooked pork chops. This seasoned coating mix came in a bag and promised crispy, flavorful pork chops without all the mess of traditional breading. The process was simple enough for kids to help with. You'd take your pork chops, rinse them under water to make them damp, then drop them into the bag with the shake and bake. Shake it up until the chops were completely covered, and then arrange them on a baking sheet into the oven. They went, and about 30 minutes later, you had pork chops with a crunchy golden coating that tasted like they'd been fried, but without standing over a hot skillet. The coating had a distinct flavor that anyone who grew up in that era can still taste. It was savory, slightly salty, and had just enough seasoning to make plain pork chops. Interesting. Shake and bake became so popular that it practically became synonymous with pork chops. Themselves, Mom would pick up a box or two at the grocery store and keep them in the pantry for those nights when she needed something quick and reliable. Kids loved the crispy coating, and the fact that they could help prepare dinner made it even more special. Pineapple pork chops. If there was one thing the 1960s and 70s loved, it was putting fruit on meat, and pineapple pork chops were a prime example of this trend. Mom would take thick cut pork chops and brown them in a skillet before topping each one with a ring of canned pineapple. Sometimes she'd use pineapple slices from a can of Dole, and other times she'd use crushed pineapple mixed with brown sugar to create a sweet glaze. The pineapple would caramelize as it cooked, creating a sticky sweet topping that contrasted beautifully with the savory pork. Beneath, some recipes called for maraschino cherries to be placed in the center of each pineapple ring, adding a pop of bright red color that made the dish look fancy enough for company. The combination of sweet and savory was considered sophisticated at the time, and it was a way to make an ordinary weeknight meal feel a little more special. The pineapple juice would mix with the pan drippings to create a light sauce that could be spooned over rice or mashed potatoes. Nowadays, the idea of fruit on meat has become less common, but back then it was absolutely standard, and pineapple pork chops were a dinner table favorite that showed up at potlucks and Sunday suppers across the country. Orange glazed pork chops. Another fruity favorite from the era was orange glazed pork chops, which took advantage of the citrus craze that swept through American kitchens. During the 1970s, Mom would make a simple glaze using orange juice, concentrate brown sugar, and a touch of mustard for tang. She'd brown the pork chops first, then pour this sticky sweet glaze over the top and let everything simmer together until the chops were tender and the glaze had thickened into a glossy coating. The orange flavor was bright and fresh, which was a nice change from the heavier cream-based sauces that were also popular. Some versions of this recipe called for orange marmalade instead of juice concentrate, which added little bits of candied orange peel to the finished dish. The result was pork chops that were both sweet and tangy, with a beautiful golden color that made them look as good as they tasted. This was another recipe that felt a little fancy, even though it was incredibly easy to make. The citrus flavor cut through the richness of the pork and made the whole meal feel lighter than some of the heavier casseroles and cream sauces of the time. Kids who didn't usually like their meat with sauce could often be convinced to try orange glazed pork chops because the sweetness appealed to their young palates. Pork chops with sauerkraut for families with German heritage, or those who just loved the tangy bite of fermented cabbage. Pork chops with sauerkraut was a classic combination that appeared on dinner tables throughout the 1960s and 70s, Mom would layer pork chops in a baking dish and then dump an entire can or jar of sauerkraut right on top sometimes. She'd add sliced apples or a bit of brown sugar to balance out the tartness, and then the whole thing would bake low and slow until the flavors melded together. The result was tender, juicy pork chops infused with the sharp, tangy flavor of the kraut, and the meat would practically fall off the bone after a couple hours in the oven. This was the kind of meal that filled the house with a distinct aroma that you either loved or hated. There was no in-between. Kids who grew up eating this dish developed a taste for sauerkraut early on, while others would pick around it to get to the meat. Underneath the beauty of this recipe was that it was a complete one-dish meal. You didn't need elaborate sides because the sauerkraut and pork were plenty filling on their own. Maybe you'd serve it with some boiled potatoes or rye bread to soak up the juices, but that was about it. Nowadays, sauerkraut has made a comeback thanks to the fermented foods trend, but back then it was just good old-fashioned comfort food. French onion pork chops in the 1970s. French onion soup was having a major moment, and it didn't take long for home cooks to figure out that the same flavors that made the soup so delicious could work magic on pork chops. Mom would brown thick pork chops in a skillet, then pile them high with caramelized onions that had been slowly cooked until they were soft, sweet, and golden brown. Some recipes called for adding a packet of Lipton onion soup mix to amp up the onion flavor even more, and then the whole thing would be topped with slices of Swiss or mozzarella cheese before going under the broiler until the cheese was melted and bubbly. The result was pork chops that tasted like French onion soup in solid form, with all the rich, savory, oniony goodness clinging to every bite. The caramelized onions added a touch of sweetness that balanced beautifully with the cheese and the pork. Itself stayed juicy and tender underneath all those toppings. This was a recipe that looked impressive, enough to serve to guests, but was easy enough to make. On a random Tuesday night, the combination of flavors was sophisticated by the standards of the time, and it made plain old pork chops feel like something special. Kids who might normally turn their noses up at onions often found this version acceptable because the onions were so sweet and mild after being cooked down. Pork chops with applesauce bake. The pairing of pork and apples is a classic combination that goes back centuries, but in the 1960s and 70s, it took on a distinctly American form with pork chops and applesauce. Bake Mom would arrange pork chops in a casserole dish and then spread a thick layer of applesauce over each chop. Some recipes called for cinnamon and brown sugar mixed into the applesauce to make it even sweeter, while others kept it simple and let the natural apple flavor shine through the dish. Would bake until the pork was tender and the applesauce had caramelized slightly around the edges, creating little pockets of concentrated apple flavor. This was comfort food at its finest, with the sweetness of the apples complementing the savory pork in a way that felt wholesome and satisfying. The applesauce would keep the meat incredibly moist during cooking, which was important because pork chops can dry out quickly. If you're not careful, this recipe was especially popular in the fall when apples were in season, and the smell of cinnamon and baking pork would fill the entire house. Kids loved this version because the applesauce made it sweet, and parents loved it because applesauce was something they always had in the pantry, whether it was homemade or store-bought. Nowadays, we might serve applesauce on the side, but back then, baking it right onto the chops was just how it was done. Pork chops Italiano. As Italian-American cuisine became more mainstream, in the 1960s, pork chops got the Italian treatment with recipes that featured tomato sauce, oregano, basil, and plenty of garlic. Mom would brown the chops, then simmer them in a simple tomato sauce made from canned crushed tomatoes, or tomato sauce seasoned with Italian herbs. Some versions called for topping the chops with mozzarella cheese and letting it melt into gooey perfection, while others kept it simple with just the tomato sauce. The result was pork chops that tasted like they belonged in an Italian restaurant, with all those bold Mediterranean flavors that were becoming increasingly popular in American homes. This was a great way to make pork chops feel a little more exotic and worldly. Even though the ingredients were things most people already had in their pantry, the tomato sauce kept the meat moist, and the herbs added a fragrant quality that made the whole meal smell amazing, while it cooked kids who loved spaghetti and pizza usually enjoyed this version because the flavors were familiar and comforting in the same way their favorite Italian dishes were. Some families would serve these pork chops with a side of spaghetti, turning it into a complete Italian feast that satisfied even the biggest appetites. This recipe showed how versatile pork chops could be and how they could take on completely different flavor profiles depending on what seasonings and sauces you used. Smothered pork chops. Smothered pork chops were a southern-inspired dish that made its way into kitchens across the country. During the 1960s and 70s, the term smothered meant the chops were cooked low and slow in a rich brown gravy made from pan drippings. Flour and broth. Mom would dredge the pork chops in seasoned flour and brown them until until they had a nice crust. Then she'd make a gravy in the same pan using the brown bits stuck to the bottom, which gave it incredible depth of flavor. The pork chops would go back into the gravy and simmer until they were so tender you could cut them with a fork. The gravy itself was thick, silky, and deeply savory, with just enough black pepper to give it a little kick. This was the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs and kept you full for hours. The gravy was so good that you needed plenty of mashed potatoes or rice to soak it all up, and there was always plenty of it because the flour and liquid created a generous amount. Kids loved dragging their pork chops through that gravy, and parents loved how economical the dish was because even cheaper cuts of pork became melt in your mouth. Tender with this cooking method, smothered pork chops were comfort food in its purest form, and they represented everything that was great about home cooking in that era. Simple ingredients transformed into something absolutely delicious through patience and technique. Barbecue pork chops, long before grilling, became the default method for making barbecue stovetop. Barbecue pork chops were a weeknight staple that brought smoky sweet flavor to the dinner table. Mom would brown the pork chops in a skillet, then pour a bottled barbecue sauce right over the top, letting everything simmer together until the chops were cooked through and the sauce had thickened into a sticky glaze. The barbecue sauce of choice was usually something like Kraft or Hunt's Tangy Sweet and thick enough to cling to every bit of meat. Some recipes called for adding a splash of Worcestershire sauce or a spoonful of brown sugar to doctor up the bottled sauce and make it taste more homemade. The result was pork chops with a deep reddish-brown color and a flavor that was both sweet and tangy with just a hint of smoke. This was an easy way to get barbecue flavor without firing up an outdoor grill, which was especially convenient during winter months or rainy days. Kids loved these pork chops because the sauce made them taste like something special, and the sweetness appealed to young palates that might reject more sophisticated flavors. You'd serve these with classic barbecue sides like coleslaw, baked beans, and cornbread, creating a complete barbecue meal. Without ever stepping outside, the key was letting the chops simmer long, enough in that sauce so they absorbed all that flavor and became fall apart. Tender, pork chops, and rice casserole. Casseroles were the ultimate convenience food of the 1960s and 70s, and pork chops and rice casserole was a one-dish wonder that appeared on dinner tables across America. Mom would arrange raw pork chops in a baking dish on top of a layer of uncooked white rice. Then she'd pour a can of cream of mushroom soup mixed with water or broth over everything. The whole thing would bake covered for about an hour, during which time the rice would cook in the liquid and the pork chops would become tender. The result was a complete meal in one pan with the rice absorbing all the flavors from the pork and the creamy sauce. The beauty of this recipe was that you didn't need to pre-cook anything or stand over a hot stove. Stirring, you just assembled it, tossed it in the oven, and walked away. Some versions called for adding frozen peas or canned green beans to make it even more of a complete meal, and others suggested sprinkling French fried onions on top during the last few minutes of baking for some crunch. This was the kind of meal that busy mothers relied on because it required minimal effort but delivered maximum comfort. The rice would be creamy and tender, the pork would be juicy, and everything would be infused with that signature cream of mushroom flavor that defines so much of the era's cooking. Nowadays, we might make this from scratch with fresh ingredients, but back then convenience was king, and this casserole delivered exactly that. Pork chops with condensed tomato soup. If cream of mushroom soup was the king of condensed soups, then tomato soup was definitely the queen, and it found its way into plenty of pork chop recipes during the 1960s and 70s. Mom would brown the pork chops, then pour a can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup right over the top, sometimes undiluted for a thicker sauce or mixed with a little water for something more gravy-like. The tomato soup would break down during cooking, creating a tangy, slightly sweet sauce that coated the pork chops and added moisture and flavor. Some recipes called for adding a splash of vinegar or Worcestershire sauce to brighten up the tomato flavor, while others kept it simple and let the soup do all the work. The result was pork chops in a smooth tomato-based sauce that was comforting and familiar. The tomato flavor wasn't overpowering, but it added just enough acidity to cut through the richness of the pork. This was another foolproof recipe that busy mothers could rely on, because if you had a can of tomato soup in the pantry, you could make dinner happen. Kids who loved tomato soup usually enjoyed this version too, because the flavors were mild and not too adventurous. You'd typically serve this with mashed potatoes or egg noodles to soak up that tomato sauce, and maybe a side of green beans or corn to round out the plate. It was simple, straightforward cooking that got dinner on the table, without a lot of fuss or fancy ingredients. Peachy pork chops. Canned peaches were a pantry staple during the 1960s and 70s, and they found their way onto pork chops in one of the sweetest preparations of the era. Mom would arrange pork chops in a baking dish and top each one with a canned peach, half sometimes. She'd fill the center of the peach with a little brown sugar or a maraschino cherry for extra sweetness and color. The whole thing would bake until the pork was tender and the peaches had caramelized slightly, creating a sticky sweet glaze that was absolutely delicious. See, the combination of pork and peaches was considered elegant and sophisticated back then. And it was the kind of dish that Mom might make when she wanted to impress guests or make a regular weeknight feel a little more special. The peach juice would mix with the pan drippings to create a light fruity sauce that could be spooned over rice or mashed potatoes, and the sweetness of the peaches perfectly complemented the savory pork. Underneath, kids loved this version because peaches were naturally sweet and appealing, and it made eating pork chops feel like having dessert for dinner. Some recipes called for adding a pinch of cinnamon or clove to the brown sugar, which gave the dish a warm, spiced quality that was perfect for fall and winter months. Nowadays, the idea of putting canned peaches on meat might seem unusual, but back then it was just another way to make an affordable cut of meat feel special and memorable. Pork chops with green beans.
We're gonna do some pork chops and some fresh string beans.
One-dish meals were incredibly popular during the 1920s, 60s, and 70s because they saved time on both cooking and cleanup, and pork chops with green beans was a perfect example of this practical approach. Mom would brown pork chops in a skillet, then add canned green beans along with the liquid from the can. Some recipes called for adding a can of cream of mushroom soup to make it more substantial, while others kept it simple with just the beans. And their juices, the whole thing, would simmer on the stovetop or bake in the oven until the pork was tender and the flavors had melded together. The green beans would absorb the porky goodness from the drippings and become soft and flavorful in a way that made them more appealing than plain steamed vegetables. This was an economical meal that stretched the budget because green beans were cheap and filling, especially when you use canned ones that were always available. The result was a complete protein and vegetable dish that only dirtied one pan, which was a huge selling point for busy mothers who already had enough to do. Some versions called for adding sliced potatoes to make it even heartier, turning it into a true one pot. Wonder that required nothing else to make a complete meal. Kids who might normally refuse green beans often found them more acceptable when they'd been cooked with pork because they tasted richer and more interesting than plain vegetables. Stuffed pork chops.
Listen, and you know it's gonna be easy, right? I'm gonna get ready to show you guys just how easy it is just to make some stuffed pork chops.
For a fancier preparation that still fit within the home cook's repertoire, stuffed pork chops were a showstopper at Sunday dinners and special occasions. Mom would cut a pocket into thick pork chops and fill it with a mixture of breadcrumbs, herbs, butter, and sometimes sausage or dried fruit. The chops were browned first, then baked until the meat was cooked through and the stuffing had formed a flavorful crust. The charm of this dish was that it looked and tasted impressive without being difficult to make. The stuffing added both moisture and flavor, turning ordinary pork chops into something special. Some recipes called for securing the opening with toothpicks, while others simply baked the chops stuffing side up. Variations were endless. Cornbread stuffing for a southern twist, apples and walnuts for a sweeter version, or classic sage and onion reminiscent of Thanksgiving. Kids loved them for the all-in-one bite, and parents appreciated how inexpensive bone-in chops could feel gourmet. These recipes were the kind passed down, with each generation adding its own touches. Pork chops with cream of celery soup. While cream of mushroom soup often gets the glory, cream of celery soup was another condensed favorite in pork chop recipes of the 1960s and 70s. Mom would brown the chops, then pour a can of cream of celery soup over them, sometimes thinned with a bit of milk to make extra sauce. The dish would simmer until the pork was tender and infused with that gentle celery flavor. The result was chops in a pale green tinge sauce, mild, comforting, and just flavorful enough to be interesting. Some recipes added chopped celery for extra texture, while others let the soup carry the flavor on its own. The creamy sauce not only kept the pork chops moist, a challenge with this lean cut, but was perfect for spooning over mashed potatoes or rice. Picky eaters often accepted it, since the celery flavor was subtle and the sauce familiar. This was another example of the versatility of pork chops and how resourceful home cooks turned simple ingredients into reliable, comforting meals that felt both easy and special. Sweet and sour. Pork chops. The sweet and sour flavor popular in Chinese American restaurants of the 1960s and 70s also made its way into home-cooked pork chops. Mom would whip up a quick sauce with ketchup, vinegar, sugar, and soy sauce, sometimes adding canned pineapple chunks for sweetness and texture. The pork chops were browned, then simmered in the tangy sauce until cooked through and coated in a glossy, sticky glaze. The result was chops that tasted mildly exotic, with the familiar sweet and sour balance Americans had come to love from takeout. The bright red sauce looked as appealing as it tasted, making a weeknight meal feel special without unusual ingredients or complicated steps. Kids adored the sweet element, which made the chops more approachable for picky palates. Some recipes included bell peppers and onions to mimic restaurant versions, and the dish was typically served over white rice to soak up every drop of sauce. This was comfort food with an international twist, a small but telling sign of how American home cooking was becoming more diverse and adventurous during this era. Pork chops with scalloped potatoes.
Today we're going to make good old-fashioned scalloped potatoes and pork chops.
Combining pork chops with scalloped potatoes was a stroke of genius, creating a complete meal in a single baking dish. Mom would layer thinly sliced potatoes in a casserole dish, arrange the pork chops on top, and pour a cream sauce or condensed soup mixture over everything. The dish baked slowly until the potatoes were tender and creamy, and the chops cooked through. The pork drippings flavored the potatoes, creating layers of taste greater than the sum of their parts. The potatoes absorbed the sauce, becoming soft and rich, while the pork stayed moist from all the surrounding liquid. This one-dish wonder was perfect for busy families, since no separate sides were needed. Some recipes added sliced onions between the potato layers or sprinkled cheese on top, near the end of baking to form a golden crust. The result was hearty, satisfying comfort food, ideal for cold weather and family gatherings. Kids loved the creamy potatoes, while parents appreciated how economical and filling the meal was, a testament to the creativity of home cooks. Honey mustard pork chops. The combination of honey and mustard grew popular during the 1970s and found a simple, effective home in pork chops. Mom would mix honey with yellow mustard to create a sweet and tangy glaze, brushing it over the chops before baking. The honey caramelized in the oven, forming a sticky golden coating, while the mustard added just enough tang to balance the sweetness. The result was chops with a glossy finish and a flavor that was both sweet and savory, with a subtle bite from the mustard. Some recipes added soy sauce or Worcestershire for extra depth, while others kept it simple with just honey and mustard. The glaze was versatile. You could adjust the sweetness or tanginess to taste, and it worked with thick or thin chops alike. Kids loved this version for its candy-like sweetness, while parents appreciated how quickly it came together on busy weeknights. Typically served with rice or roasted vegetables, it created a well-rounded plate that looked impressive yet required minimal effort. Spanish rice pork chops. Spanish rice was a popular side dish during the 1960s and 70s, and it didn't take long for home cooks to figure out that you could make it a complete meal by adding pork chops. Mom would brown pork chops in a skillet, then set them aside while she sauteed onions and green peppers, before adding rice tomato sauce or crushed tomatoes and seasonings like cumin and chili powder. The pork chops would go back into the pan, nestled into the rice mixture, and everything would simmer together until the rice was tender and the pork was cooked through. The result was a one-pan meal, with the rice absorbing all the flavors from the pork and the tomato-based sauce, creating something that was hearty, filling, and packed with flavor. This was a great way to stretch a pound of pork chops to feed a larger family, because the rice added so much bulk to the meal. The flavors were mildly spicy, but not overwhelming, which made it acceptable to most palates, including picky kids who might be suspicious of anything too exotic. Some versions called for adding frozen peas or corn during the last few minutes of cooking to boost the vegetable content, while others kept it simple. With just the peppers and onions, this recipe showed the influence of Tex-Mex cuisine that was becoming more mainstream in American cooking, and it was a budget-friendly way to make dinner interesting and flavorful without breaking the bank. Pork chops with mushroom gravy. While cream of mushroom soup was a pantry staple, making mushroom gravy from scratch was considered a step up, a sign that the cook took pride in her meal. Mom would start by browning the pork chops, then set them aside while she sauteed fresh sliced mushrooms in the same pan. As the mushrooms turned golden and fragrant, she'd sprinkle in flour to make a roux, then gradually whisk in broth or milk to create a rich, creamy gravy. The pork chops would return to the pan to simmer gently, absorbing the flavors and finishing fully cooked and tender. The result was pork chops coated in a silky, flavorful gravy, dotted with real mushrooms that added earthy depth and a satisfying, meaty texture that canned soup could never replicate. Making the gravy from scratch allowed precise control over seasoning, consistency, and richness, elevating a simple weeknight dish into something restaurant-worthy. Children Children who grew up on the familiar comfort of cream of mushroom soup might find the texture of real mushrooms unusual at first, but the flavor often won them over. Served over a bed of mashed potatoes or egg noodles, with perhaps some steamed green beans or carrots on the side, these pork chops offered a complete, balanced meal. It was a dish that combined comfort with sophistication, showing that home cooking could be both approachable and impressive, a perfect example of how everyday ingredients could be transformed into something special with just a little extra effort and care. Hawaiian pork chops. The tiki craze and fascination with all things Hawaiian during the 1960s and 70s brought a tropical twist to pork chops that captured the imagination of home cooks. Mom would brown the pork chops, then top them with pineapple rings, maraschino cherries, and a sweet glaze made from pineapple juice, brown sugar, and soy sauce. The dish baked until the pork was tender, and the glaze had caramelized into a sticky, flavorful coating. The result was pork chops that looked like they belonged at a luau, with bright colors and tropical flavors that transported you far from the suburban kitchen. The combination of sweet pineapple, savory soy sauce, and rich pork was considered both sophisticated and fun, a way to make a weeknight meal feel like a special occasion. Some recipes suggested serving the chops over rice, sometimes with extra pineapple chunks to reinforce the Hawaiian theme. Kids adored the sweetness, while the cherries added a playful pop of color, making the dish visually exciting. This recipe reflected a larger trend in American home cooking, experimenting with international flavors and bold combinations. While not authentically Hawaiian, it brought the allure of the islands to the dinner table in an approachable way. The tiki pork chops were memorable not just for their taste, but for the sense of fun and adventure they brought to mealtime, sparking conversation, delighting kids, and giving families a little tropical escape without ever leaving home. Or breaded ranch pork chops. As ranch dressing and ranch seasoning became ubiquitous during the 1970s, it was only a matter of time before someone figured out that ranch flavor worked beautifully on breaded pork chops. Mom would mix ranch dressing mix with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers to create a flavorful coating for pork chops. The chops would be dipped in beaten egg, then dredged in the ranch breadcrumb mixture before being baked or fried until golden and crispy. The result was pork chops with a crunchy coating that tasted tangy, herby, and utterly addictive. Thanks to all those ranch flavors, this was a kid-friendly version that even picky eaters would usually accept, because ranch was already a familiar and beloved flavor that most children associated with vegetables and pizza. The coating stayed crispy and provided a nice textural contrast to the tender, juicy pork. Underneath, some recipes called for adding grated Parmesan cheese to the breadcrumb mixture for extra flavor, while others kept it simple with just the ranch seasoning. You could make these in the oven for a healthier version, or pan fry them if you wanted that extra crispy exterior that came from cooking in oil. Either way, they were delicious, and they showed how new products like ranch seasoning mix were changing the way Americans cooked at home. This recipe became a family favorite in many households, and it's still made today by people who grew up eating it in the 1970s. Lipton onion soup mix pork chops. Lipton onion soup mix was a miracle ingredient during the 1960s and 70s, showing up in everything from dips to pot roasts and, of course, pork chops. Mom would coat pork chops with a dry soup mix, pressing it into the meat so it would stick before either baking or pan frying them. The soup mix would create a flavorful crust on the outside of the pork chops that was salty, savory, and deeply oniony in the best possible way. Some recipes called for mixing the soup mix with breadcrumbs or crushed cornflakes to create an even thicker coating, while others used it straight from the packet. The result was pork chops with an intensely flavored exterior that packed way more punch than plain seasoned meat. This was another foolproof recipe that busy mothers relied on, because all you needed was a packet of soup mix and some pork chops. No other seasonings or complicated preparations required. The onion flavor was bold without being overwhelming, and it made even basic pork chops taste special. Kids who might normally be suspicious of onions usually found this version acceptable because the onion was in dried form and didn't have that slimy texture that turned many youngsters off. You'd typically serve this with mashed potatoes or rice to balance out the salty intensity of the coating, and maybe some corn or green beans on the side. This recipe was so popular that many families still make it today as a nostalgic reminder of dinner at Grandma's house. Pork chops with Bossy's Worcestershire glaze. Worcestershire sauce was a kitchen staple in the 1960s and 70s, and it found a perfect home in a simple yet flavorful pork chop glaze that delivered big taste with minimal effort. Mom would mix Worcestershire sauce with butter, brown sugar, and garlic to create a savory sweet glaze, brushing it onto the chops before and during cooking. The Worcestershire added deep umami richness, elevating the pork beyond ordinary seasoning, while the brown sugar caramelized, forming a sticky, glossy coating. The butter tied everything together, adding velvety richness and producing chops that looked elegant yet were surprisingly easy to prepare. The finished dish had a dark, lustrous finish and a flavor that balanced sweet, savory, and the distinctive tang Worcestershire imparts. Some recipes included a splash of lemon juice to brighten the glaze, while others kept it simple, letting the core ingredients shine. The glaze was versatile. You could adjust the sweetness or intensity of the Worcestershire to suit your family's tastes, and it worked equally well, baked, grilled, or pan-fried. Kids who loved steak sauce often enjoyed this version, finding the flavors familiar but slightly elevated, giving the pork a more grown-up sophistication. What made this recipe enduring wasn't just the flavor, it was how it transformed an everyday cut of meat into a dish that looked and tasted like restaurant-quality cooking. Approachable for weeknights, yet impressive for guests, it showed how pantry staples could become the foundation for meals that felt special with minimal effort. If you grew up in the 1960s and 70s, these pork chop recipes likely bring back a flood of memories. The smell of them cooking, the way they looked next to mashed potatoes or rice, and the comfort of a familiar, satisfying dinner made with love. Pork chops were more than just an affordable cut of meat. They were a canvas for creativity, allowing home cooks to transform ordinary pantry staples into something special. While today we might prepare them with fresh herbs, marinades, or precise techniques, there's a unique charm in the simplicity of these classic recipes, which brought families together night after night and left lasting memories.